Shabbat Shalom. My name is Rabbi Starr from Congregation Shaarey Zedek, and I want to send a hearty Shabbat Shalom to all of our Shaarey Zedek family, to the entire community of Metro Detroit, and really to all the world. Anyone who's watching, I wish you a Shabbat Shalom. People have been amazingly kind and generous over this last week or so in the midst of this plague that has descended upon us. People have really been amazingly kind and generous. They're texting me, they're calling me, Rabbi, how are you doing? How are you holding up? And so here I am in this mix of feelings, because on one hand, thank God, we are healthy today. And also I'm excited to share with you that my brother David and his wife Brittany have had a new baby. There's a new star, a star is born, if you will. So we welcome Eliana Starr into the world. We wish her a Shabbat Shalom and pray that she should know a world of health and blessing and joy. I wish a mazel tov to my parents on their new grandchild, their first granddaughter, and a mazel tov to my grandfather, Wolf Gruka, on the birth of his first great-granddaughter, another great-grandchild. So mazel tov, mazel tov. So here we are in the midst of all this joy and this blessing, while at the same time self-quarantining, knowing what is in the world around us. It's scary. We're all a little bit scared. We're all trying to do our best to help those who are in need, those who are vulnerable. And so here we are in this mix of emotions. So I was thinking about that in anticipation of Shabbat. Every Shabbat we use this beautiful Kiddush cup. It's a gift from my brother-in-law Jonathan from his parents of blessed memory. And Rebecca and I have been using it for the nearly 2 decades of our marriage each and every Friday night as we make Kiddush. And it's a wonderful, joyful way to enter Shabbat with this Kiddush. We fill it full of wine. The custom is actually to take your glass and to overflow it so that the wine actually spills down the side. Kosi revaya, because my cup overflows. We're so blessed in this world. Thank God. We have everything we need and most of what we want. We are truly, truly blessed. This amazing community and family that is Congregation Shaarey Zedek. We are blessed. My cup overflows with joy. But lately, with everything going on this last week or so, I still feel that same joy. But I feel an incredible sense of vulnerability. For myself, for sure, for my family, even more, but for our community and for everyone around us, Jew and non-Jew alike, for everyone in the world, I feel an incredible sense of vulnerability. So there's this strange tension between the blessing and the joy and recognizing how blessed we are and the vulnerability. And I almost thought that this Shabbat, it almost feels like we should be making Kiddush out of a paper cup. Sure, we can still overflow our cup with joy and with blessing, that is the wine, but it's much more fragile and could go at any minute. We have the tension, the blessing and the joy, and this incredible sense of vulnerability. Isn't that in so many ways the Jewish story? We read this week Parashat Va-yak-hei, and we mark Shabbat HaChodesh. This is the last Shabbat before the Hebrew month of Nisan begins. And of course, Nisan is the month in which we will celebrate Passover. And as we come to this Torah portion, Parashat Va-yak-hei, we are nearing the end of the book of Shmot, the book of Exodus. Now, what is the book of Exodus? And as I was doing learning on it and reflecting on it, the book of Exodus begins with building. The book of Exodus ends with building. Right? We Jews are builders. We build community. We build family. We build relationships. We build society. Right? We Jews are builders. And so the book of Exodus begins in many ways as an act of building, because we are required, right? We are enslaved and thus forced to build buildings, storehouses, temples for Pharaoh. We're required to build. We have no choice. 7 days a week, 365 days a year, we were enslaved and forced to build for Pharaoh. This is the story that we tell on Passover. Avadim ayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. Right? We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And then as we say in the Haggadah, ata b'nei chorim. But now we are free. And as we come to the book of Exodus, we come to Parashat Va-yak-hei. And as we've been reading the last couple weeks and we'll continue to read, at the end of the book of Exodus, we're commanded to build a mikdash, a sacred place in the wilderness, this Mishkan, this portable sanctuary that we would travel with during our 40 years of wandering. And so the book of Exodus really concludes with this act of building as well. As we know, we read a couple weeks ago, God says to our ancestors, Asuli mikdash v'shachati b'tocham, build for me a sanctuary that I may dwell among you. Exodus begins with building as slaves to Pharaoh. Exodus ends with being able to build in our freedom to God. And of course, we know in building to Pharaoh, we had no choice. We had to do exactly what Pharaoh told us. But as we build this Mishkan, this portable sanctuary, this mikdash, this sanctuary in the wilderness to God, God says in many ways, bring what your heart moves you to bring. And God gives us a certain sense of freedom to bring our free will to this holy act of building. The book of Exodus begins with building, and it ends with building. But in between, we come to the very beginning of our Torah portion this week, Parashat Va-yak-hei. And I want to share with you what it says in between these great acts of building, the enslavement and the service to God. Va-yak-hei Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael vayomer alehem. Moses then convened the entire Israelite community and said to them, Ela devarim asher tziva Hashem la'asot otam. These are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. Sheshet yamim ta'aseh melacha, v'yom hashvi'i yeh lachem kodesh Shabbat, Shabbaton l'Hashem. On 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. And it goes on to say, Kol ha'oseh bo melacha yumat. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. That's from Exodus 35. And then it goes on to tell us as well, you shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Sabbath day. Moses said further to the whole community of Israelites, this is what the Lord has commanded you. Take from among you gifts to the Lord. Everyone whose heart so moves him shall bring them. And it goes on to talk about the building of this mikdash, this portable sanctuary in the wilderness. Our Parashat begins, Parashat Va-yak-hei begins with Shabbat. We've just come out of Egypt. Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, where we were forced to build exactly as Pharaoh told us, 365 days a year, 7 days a week, maybe 24 hours a day. We were slaves. We were forced to build. Now we're about to build this incredible sanctuary for us to be able to connect to God, this act of joy and free will. In between these two acts of building, we have Shabbat, the great pause. And God is so passionate about Shabbat that he says, do nothing. Before you transition to building a temple for me, God says, I want you to have a Shabbat, a Sabbath, a day of rest, of peace, of community, of inner sanctuary, of building our inner temples in order to connect to God and to connect to each other. That's what Shabbat is. In between forced building and voluntary building, we rest. Shabbat. It is the most beautiful day of the year. And of course, as we know about Shabbat, it begins with Kiddush. At Shabbat lunch, we make Kiddush again. And then Shabbat comes out at Havdalah time with yet another Kiddush. There are 3 opportunities to show that our cup overflows with blessing. Even if this week, our cup, we have a different cup that is overflowing with blessing, a symbol of our fragility, of our vulnerability. Nevertheless, Shabbat begins with Kos Kiddush, with a cup of Kiddush. Shabbat comes to its peak at lunchtime with Kos Kiddush, with a Kiddush cup. And Shabbat comes to an end at Havdalah time on Saturday night with yet another, a third Kiddush cup. A reminder to ourselves that indeed our blessings overflow, even in the midst of preparing to build again. In so many ways, we are marking a Shabbat right now. We've spent most of our life building buildings, building society, building community, building lives, building careers, building families. And please God, we will have an opportunity to build again very soon. All of those things even better than before. But right now, we're required to have Shabbat, the sanctity of self-quarantine. We are choosing to take a break from building. We're choosing to be in our homes. We're choosing to create a physical separation from others for the sake of those who are most vulnerable around us. This act of Shabbat in which we find ourselves now during the COVID-19, this act of Shabbat is an incredible act of chesed, of kindness. It's an incredible act of ahava, of love. It's an incredible act of gemilut chasadim, these acts of loving kindness. What we are doing now in the midst of COVID-19 is a Shabbat for ourselves and a Shabbat for our community and the world in order to allow those who are most vulnerable to stay alive, and in order to allow our healthcare professionals who are amazing and are totally giving of themselves right now, may God bless you, to be able to handle this crisis and lead us through this crisis and care for us through this crisis. Self-quarantining, even if you haven't been exposed, limiting our travels, self-quarantining to our homes, except for our mandatory trips out, is an incredible act of chesed, of kindness. It is in many ways acting like God wants us to act. And this is our Shabbat in between the two periods of building in our lifetime. Now, many of us have done a wonderful job over the last week or so of self-quarantining. There are some who have failed to observe this Shabbat. They put themselves at risk for sure, but they put so many others at risk. To not observe this Shabbat is an incredible act of selfishness, just as in many ways to not mark Shabbat at all is an incredible act of focusing on oneself and not community and not God. This act of Shabbat right now is for others. My fear is as we come out of this week and go into yet another week, and perhaps down the road yet another week of this self-quarantining, of this physical separation, the people will start to wane in their observance of this Shabbat. Sure, they practiced and they drank the first cup of Kiddush, but they're not going to drink the second cup of Kiddush, nor are they going to drink the third cup of Kiddush. And this virus may continue. It may get worse. We may put our healthcare professionals at risk in so many different ways, including for them not to be able to care for us and those who are most vulnerable. This week of Parashat Va-yak-hei, this week of Shabbat HaChodesh, this week of the incredible sanctity of self-quarantine, we are required to observe a true Shabbat for ourselves and for others. May it continue into next week, if we have to. May it continue into another week. But let us observe the full Shabbat, not just one glass of wine, not just 2 glasses of wine, but all 3 glasses of wine, a full Shabbat, in order to continue this act of incredible chesed, of kindness, for the most vulnerable around us, and in order to help protect and serve our healthcare professionals who are trying to take care of us. That's where we find ourselves now. So I encourage you, observe Shabbat, these 25 hours of rest. I encourage you to observe this greater Shabbat, this pause in between the 2 acts of building in our life, for your own sake, your own health, but for the health of so many around us, including and especially the most vulnerable. Please observe Shabbat, observe this self-quarantine, keep physical distance. Indeed, there is sanctity to self-quarantining. This is the Shabbat we are required to observe right now in our lives. May it be a Shabbat Kodesh, may it be a holy Sabbath, may we Shavat Vayinafash, may we be able to refresh and rejuvenate during this Shabbat. May we find ways to experience and feel joy and God's blessing on this Shabbat. And just as we do on Shabbat, we take an opportunity to bless our children and to thank our parents. I invite you to pick up the phone, to call a loved one, to call a friend, a family member, and just tell them you love them. Say, how are you doing? Perhaps not even just a family member or a loved one, a friend. Find someone who you know may be alone. Just pick up the phone and call them and say, how are you doing? That too is an incredible act of chesed, of kindness, as we prepare for Shabbat and as we come out of Shabbat. May it be a Shabbat Vayinafash, may it be a day of rest and of rejuvenation for all of us. May we remember all the ways in which Kosi Ravayan, which our cups overflow. And may we, in the midst of this unique Shabbat, find joy and give thanks, but also keep ourselves at a distance, keep ourselves healthy and safe, and keep all those around us safe. I wish you indeed a Shabbat Shalom. May our cups continue to overflow with health, with blessing, and with joy. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei pari hagafen. Shabbat Shalom.